Вибори у США. Що це було? Лекція Howie Гокінса, кандидата в президенти США від партії зелених на виборах 2020 року.
Добрий день! Всіх вітаємо на події, яку проводимо на соціальному центрі соціального руху за підтримки Датського інституту партії демократії. Сьогодні у нас в гостях Гові Гокінс, який був кандидатом у президенти Сполучених Штатів від партії зелених на минулих виборах, вже позаминулих 2020 року, зайнявши там 4-те місце. І зараз, звісно, в дуже багатьох і в США, в світі загалом, в Україні зокрема, увага прикута до можливих наслідків тих для багатьох абсолютно таких шокуючих результатів президентських виборів і того, що може статися з світом загалом, і, зокрема, з підтримкою України. Але сам Гові, зараз він розповість трохи про себе і чому він в тому числі перебуває зараз в Україні і загалом має це європейське своє турне. Але в його особі ми маємо одного з таких найбільш послідовних, найбільш переконаних наших друзів, які беруть участь в мережах солідарності з Україною лівих активістів Сполучених Штатів і активісток. І сам Гові, він ще з кінця 60-х років був практично в кожному найвідомішому і не тільки масовому русі соціальному. Будь-то рух проти війни у В'єтнамі і зараз проти російської агресії в Україні, будь-то профспілковий рух. Буквально донедавна Гові працював в нічну зміну до 2017 року, зокрема будівельником, вантажником і, відповідно, є профспілковим активістом бойовим з профспілки дальнобійників Teamsters. І так само він брав участь в численних лівих політичних організаціях і ініціативах і стояв біля витоків організованого зеленого руху в Сполучених Штатах, який потім переріс в партію зелених. А тоді, ще в 80-х роках, він працював зокрема з Мюрреєм Букченим, і разом вони створювали ініціативи екосоціалістичного, екоанархістського характеру. І взагалі Гові – це людина, яка протягом всього життя була послідовна в відстоюванні прав трудового народу і в Сполучених Штатах, і далеко за їх межами. І наслідком цієї такої послідовності, його солідарної позиції, було і те, що зараз він прибув спершу до Грузії, тепер до України і далі буде Європою. Але я не забиратиму слова в самого Гові, який розповість про свій більш ніж півстолітній досвід активізму і політичної боротьби, і, зокрема, про те, чого нам чекати зараз, і що робити людям в Сполучених Штатах, і в Україні, і загалом у світі. So, Howie, I did an introductory statement. I briefly described who you are, but I guess that you will be... it's up to you to describe the reasons of your being in Ukraine and what are you doing at this moment, and in general the situation in the US, how do you evaluate and how different social movements should react to this.
Okay, well, thank you, Dennis. I know you well, so I know it was a good introduction, even though I couldn't understand it because I don't understand Ukrainian. Well, the purpose of my trip was I work with the Ukraine Solidarity Network in the United States, and we have a problem on the left. Most of the left in America is ignorant and confused, particularly about the left and progressive forces in Eastern Europe. So I wanted to express my solidarity by being here, but also to have some of you, I've interviewed Vitaly and I've interviewed others, to get your voices amplified back home. I think in America there's even among the militant so-called anti-imperialists, they never talk to the people in the situation, particularly in Ukraine. Taras Billis wrote that open letter to the Western left, and I've circulated it to some of these campuses, and they are very arrogant. It's like they know better than Taras does about what's going on in Ukraine. So they're hardcore campus whose minds you're not going to change. But there are a lot of people, particularly young people now coming into the movement against the genocide in Gaza, which the organizations mobilizing the demonstrations tend to be campus, basically, Stalinists. And so the young people coming in, when they think about Ukraine, they're learning about it from these Stalinists. So that's an audience, even if we can't convince the campus. And this is the basic picture of support for Ukraine in the United States is the center and the broad liberal left support Ukraine. It's obvious, as it should be to everybody, that Russia invaded Ukraine. The only imperialist army in Ukraine is Russia's. And we've got these people on the margins of the left, and then the MAGA Republicans, the Trump Republicans on the right, who buy the Kremlin narrative that NATO provoked it, as if Russia's defending itself by attacking Ukraine. And it's hard to believe, but people do believe that. And that's, in my Green Party, we were divided on National Committee. Narrowly, they voted against arms to Ukraine and against sanctions for Russia and called for negotiations. They don't say who's going to negotiate or what ought to come out of those negotiations. That's partly the influence of kind of a knee-jerk pacifism. You know, there's not an aggressor and a defender. There's just anybody who's got a gun is wrong in the eyes of these pacifists. So that was a problem. It's the same thing in Democratic Socialists of America. You know, the Green Party is probably the biggest group on the left if you count people who register and vote in Green Party primaries or conventions, maybe 500,000. And DSA's about 1/10 of that, but their membership there, dues-paying membership, they're at about 50,000. Same problem. They're divided down the middle. So the broad center and left supports Ukraine. The MAGA Republicans don't. And then in the far left, the left independent and to the left of the Democratic Party, it's divided. And so those are some of the people I'm speaking to. And, you know, I'm up against people like Noam Chomsky, who ought to know better, considers himself an anarchist, although in the last couple of decades, he's tended to defer to the Democratic Party, which is hard to reconcile with an anarchist position. And Jeffrey Sachs, you know, the neoliberal shock therapist for Eastern Europe, is now an authority that some of these people on the left cite. And I guess that's because he's got, you know, his Harvard credentials and he's been close to the establishment. So when he comes out, in fact, our Green Party candidate this year, Jill Stein, has the opposite position of me on Ukraine. And she gets her knowledge from Jeffrey Sachs. Says she's going to make him Secretary of State if she was elected. So that's the problem we're confronting. And the second purpose is I wanted to make connections with Greens across Europe, not just Eastern Europe, because there hasn't been much communication. And I don't know if you all were aware, but last Friday, the European Green Party sent an open letter saying Jill Stein should drop out of the presidential race and endorse Harris. And they cited her position on Ukraine, which I think she deserved criticism. But then they said Kamala Harris would be a reliable partner on climate change and peace in the Middle East, which is pretty preposterous. So my biggest criticism is, why the hell are these, the American Greens responded and criticized the European Greens on the same day. So why the hell are the European and American Greens sending open letters about each other when they haven't even talked to each other in years? And I kind of anticipated this problem was coming. I didn't know it'd be manifest the way it was last Friday. So that's another purpose, to open up communications with Greens in Europe and explain to them, you know, why we have this division between internationalists and campists in the Green Party in the United States, but also that we're not all taking Jill Stein's position. It's very controversial, her position on Ukraine. And that their understanding of the Democratic Party in the United States is pretty naive. That's a party that is terrible on climate, on economic inequality, and democracy itself. I mean, ballot access for the Green Party, just to get on the ballot, is very hard. I'll give you one example. In my state of New York, after I got 5% and the governor was trying to run up his vote, his father had been the governor. He wanted to get more than his father ever got. His name is Andrew Cuomo. More than he got when he was first elected in 2010. And I got 5% of the vote because people were voting for me on the basis of funding the public schools, a ban on fracking, paid family leave, and a $15 minimum wage. And this governor wasn't for those. He was a Democrat who was a fiscal conservative. And 5% is the most a left third parties ever got in New York. And our left third parties go back to the Liberty Party that opposed slavery in the 1840s. So his response was initially to adopt some of those positions I just mentioned to try to compete for those votes that I got. But then when he got the chance, he changed the ballot access law. Our former qualification, if you didn't already have ballot status, was 15,000 signatures in 42 days. And he tripled that to 45,000 signatures in 42 days. Now, I've looked around the world, and the only place I can find comparable is Putin's Russia. And their standard is like our old standard, 15,000 in 45 days. If you want to run for the State Duma from an oblast. which is the equivalent of a statewide position in New York, running for governor. And I've lobbied New York legislators and their staffs to get our ballot access law made a little less onerous. And I say, we'd be happy to just get back to the Putin standard. And the legislators and their staff kind of chuckle and laugh nervously and say, I'm right. But so far, they haven't done it. The point is, the Democrats have made it so hard to get on the ballot that in New York, it was the only state where only Harris and Trump were on the ballot for president. There were no other third-party options. And that's something they're doing across the country. They spend a lot of time trying to knock Jill Stein off the ballot and other third-party candidates. So that's one of the messages I want to talk to the European Greens about. So I know everybody wants to figure out what happened on Tuesday. How did, a convicted felon who insults everybody, who, everybody knows is a liar. If you actually look at his business record, he's a terrible businessman. He went bankrupt owning a casino. I mean, the house always wins unless you're Donald Trump, because he was sucking money out of that for his other losing ventures. How this guy gets back in power? Well, I think first thing you have to understand is he didn't get more votes than he got in 2020 when Biden beat him. In fact, at the count at this point, he's about a million votes less than he got in 2020. Now, they're still counting mail ballots. He may get back to the 74 million he got, but it's not going to be many more, if any more. The difference is Biden got 81.3 million votes in 2020, and Harris, as of yesterday, only had 69 million. That's a difference of about a little over 12 million. So there's about a 10 million Biden vote in 2020 that didn't vote this time. That explains the difference. That was a swing. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, why didn't those people vote? And I think what you had was Trump offering a right-wing economic populism, which is, full of, it's a nonsensical program, but he gave the people the sense that he was the outsider, the anti-establishment, the change candidate. He was the change candidate, and the American working and middle classes want change. 5 decades of neoliberalism, and people have a hard time paying the bills every month. And then we went through this period of inflation. And Harris, on the other hand, ran as the establishment insider. She was going to normalize everything. She was going to, preserve democracy and, be, kind of responsible. But when you thought, okay, what issues did she stand for? If you think of Bernie Sanders, it's Medicare for all. You think of Donald Trump, it's scapegoating immigrants and building a wall. You think of Kamala Harris, nothing comes up. She didn't offer people a program and a change. And she had her opportunity. She could have broke with Biden on the, lockstep support for Netanyahu and the genocide in Gaza. All she had to do is say, well, we should condition the arms we're sending to Israel on them adhering to human rights, which is already U.S. law. I mean, it wasn't like a radical break, but she couldn't even symbolically, do that. So I think that also added. But the main thing was he was a right-wing economic populist. If there had been a progressive economic populist program, the kind of thing Bernie Sanders ran on, I think Trump would have been crushed, because that's what people are looking for. We know that from public opinion polling. But the Democratic Party will never do that, because their funders and their professional managerial, cadre for the party and their supporters would never do that. They are socially liberal on questions of race and gender and LGBTQ rights, but that's about as far as it goes. So on economic class issues, they are as bad as the Republicans, who, they've had bipartisan neoliberal policies now for 5 decades. So they have no solution to the things that are making the working and middle classes in America angry. And so they voted for Trump, not more than they did in 2020, but enough because Harris lost her base, at least enough of her base to lose the election. And so then the other thing I'll say a few words about is, so how does the left play a role, the independent left? And unfortunately, we had 3 candidates that got on some ballots. Jill Stein, 39 ballots. Claudia de la Cruz got on 19. She represents the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is a neo-Stalinist formation. I mean, their idea of socialism is North Korea, which is never going to be popular with the masses, but they have enough people, particularly college students, that they've organized into their party that they had the people to get on the ballot. Claudia didn't get a lot of votes. And then Cornel West, who's a well-known public intellectual in the black tradition. And he originally was going to run as a Green, but he didn't know what he was doing. He'd never been an organizer, never even been in an organization. And when he got into the Greens, he realized he had to go to the different states and convince people that they should nominate him. So he said, oh, I don't want to bother with that. I'm just going to go straight to the people. But he went straight off the ballots. So, you know, he was on the ballots of, you know, maybe 20% of the people could have voted for him. And he ended up with, you know, 1/10 of 1%. 1 in 1,000 people voted for Cornel West. Unfortunately, all three of those candidates who had any purchase or support on the far left were all against Ukraine solidarity. And we didn't have an internationalist independent left candidate in this race, which was disappointing. So my vote this time was the most unenthusiastic vote I've ever cast. I did vote for Stein, had to write her in my state of New York, but I was voting more for the idea of a independent party on the left than Jill Stein as a candidate, and also against the U.S. Arming this genocide in Gaza. So, how long do you want me to go? I could go maybe 5-10 more minutes, or
yeah, it's up to you. You can you can go even more if you have something to say that you think it's critical to deliver.
Well, you know, then the question comes up, okay, well, if the left was, you know, did so poorly, both in terms of the vote it got, but also the program it presented, you know, what can we do? And I would argue, and am arguing, that the left has got to be active between elections, and not just in elections, but in the unions and the social movements. It needs to be a mass party of the left. And we should still run presidential candidates because we can have an impact. It helps us get ballot lines. But it's difficult because automatically we're spoilers because we have this winner-take-all system, not a preferential or proportional system. The major parties have billions to spend. At best, you know, we raise $1 million or $2 million. So they outspend us 1,000 to 1. And so we're dwarfed. And the corporate media follows the money, so we hardly get any attention in the campaign. But it's still worth running because, as I said, we get ballot lines, we recruit new people, and we can put our policy platform out there, which does recruit people and speaks to people on the left. But to have impact on national policy, I think we got to build from below. We've got to, there are over 500,000 locally elected offices in the United States. The Greens have maybe 170 local elected. We should have thousands, and that should be the basis for getting people in state legislatures, and from there to the House of Representatives. Those are still local races. There's 750,000 in the district, but a good, strong local can run those candidates, run competitive races, and eventually win some. When we get a caucus of Greens, or whatever our left party in the United States is, in the House of Representatives, then we got some leverage. Because when the Democrats want to pass legislation, they're going to have to come to us, and they're going to have to give us something to get some votes. We'll be able to bargain. I think that's the way forward to have an impact. And the other thing I think we need to look at historically, from the 1830s until the 1930s, third parties on the left set the agenda. In 1829 and 1830, we had working men's parties, which were kind of ahead of their time. Marx was still 10 years old when they formed these parties. And it was formed by the emerging industrial working class, but the overall program was an agrarian kind of program because most people were either small farmers or craftspeople or shopkeepers. So the program was oriented to them, but it was ahead of its time. It wanted to abolish slavery and give the freed people land and capital so they could start farms, wanted to enfranchise American Indians and incorporate them into the United States, wanted to enfranchise women, and then for the large industrial enterprises that were emerging, have them collectively owned. So, you know, this is 1829, 1830. That kind of fell apart, but a lot of those people went into the Liberty Party, an abolitionist party to get rid of slavery, and slavery became the issue. And that evolved in the Free Soil Party, Republican Party. Eventually, the Republicans got a majority in Congress. You know, they say Abraham Lincoln was the only third-party candidate to win the presidency. No, he was a first-party candidate because the Republicans had the largest caucus in Congress. The Whig Party was falling apart, and the Republicans took their place. So there were basically 3 factions in Congress at that time. And then after the Civil War, we had these populist farmer labor parties, the Greenback Labor Party and the People's Party. And their issues were the rise of corporate power and monopolies and the need for public ownership of utilities like the telegraph system and the railroad system and the electric power system as those things developed. And those became big issues. And there was legislation adopted to deal with some of those questions. The Sherman antitrust law, you know, in the middle of the 1880s, I guess, you know, was an attempt to deal with that. So, and then we had the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas, who put, you know, got things like child labor abolition and regulation of labor safety and working hours and union recognition, and then public provision of pensions, which became Social Security, and other programs. So the Socialist Party put issues on the table, and they had power. They had some people in Congress. All these parties I'm mentioning after the Civil War had members of Congress, state legislatures, controlled some cities. So that's just to show it can be done. What happened in 1936 is the communists said, fascism is coming. And it was in Europe, but in the United States, the Republicans weren't fascists. They were conservatives. But anyway, the communists said all the left and the labor movement should go into the Democratic Party. And it's never left, except for, you know, a few of us on the edges. Most people who call themselves socialists work in the Democratic Party, but they disappear as a distinct identity, an alternative organization and policy platform. So most people don't know where the socialists are. They're working for liberals or neoliberals now in the Democratic Party. That's, you know, what we got to get beyond and finally do the long overdue task that European countries accomplished in the late 19th century, and that is form a mass party representing the working class. So anyway, those are, you know, my thoughts about it. And I guess I'll just close by saying, I think what you're doing in Sultan Uruk is really a good example for us in the United States. I mean, the quality of, you know, your writings and the interviews we read, the statements you put out. And then, you know, I'll report back on this. You guys are very active, and I think it's a good example for the Green Party, which tends to, our party, when somebody calls a demonstration and it's not the Green Party, we show up, but we don't organize it. And we leave that to other people. And so we kind of, our activity rises and falls with elections. I mean, Dennis was just saying, you know, you guys have an event going on in Kryvyi and in Lviv and here in Kyiv. And that's the kind of thing I think is a good example for us. So I'm going to report that back. And I think, you know, some of the things the East European left is doing, particularly it's understanding that multipolarity isn't anti-imperialist, it's multi-imperialist, at least in the conception of Putin and these other authoritarian states. And that's something that our left needs to learn, because you kind of have to understand what's in their mind. I mean, U.S. imperialism from Vietnam to Iraq and now Gaza has been so vicious that for a lot of people who consider themselves progressive and opposed to U.S. imperialism, if the U.S. is supporting Ukraine, they just assume we're supporting the wrong side. And that's, it's not excusing them, but it's trying to understand how a lot of people have ended up in that position. So hopefully my trip here will help some people back in the States on the left, you know, figure out where they ought to be and not be confused about what's going on here. And also, you know, if we're going to have a left that deals with the problems that capitalism creates, with inequality and war and climate disaster, we're not going to have a left in America that has broad support if we can't figure out which side it's on in the, you know, Russian invasion of Ukraine. So thanks for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Відповіді на питання про політику США та як це відобразиться на світовому суспільстві.
Honestly, don't you think that running for the presidential election as a third-party candidate is kind of futile? It's like, in a way, like, you know you're not going to win the presidential election. Wouldn't it be more effective to just do like the groundwork, run for, I don't know, Senate and the governor, you know,
especially when the presidential candidate is Putinist, practically.
Yeah, like, you know, because when you're running for a presidential election, it sort of just acts as a spoiler for the Democrats. And the Democrats are obviously better than Donald Trump. So, like, wouldn't it be sort of in a way more effective to do the groundwork, right, in like individual states or cities and everything, or maybe sort of incorporate into the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders and, you know, all of these people, right, and sort of move them to the left gradually.
Well, that's been the perennial debate since the Popular Front in the United States. As a practical matter, to be able to run down ballot for local or state office, you need a ballot line. If you don't have a ballot line, you have onerous petition requirements. One of the things the presidential race can do is secure ballot lines in states. And it's 51 different jurisdictions, so it widely varies. You know, from getting 0.5% in New Mexico, gets in the presidential race, gets the Green Party ballot status for the next election cycle, to 20% in Alabama. You know, so, you know, we haven't had a Green Party in Alabama. Every state is different. In New York now it's 2%, which is probably in this election was about, like the last one was about maybe it's going to be a little less. It was 173,000 votes. The old standard to keep a ballot line was 50,000. So anyway, the ballot access is one thing. If we don't raise our positions, then we're kind of folding up the tents and disappearing on national policy. And the only races that are national, the only race is the presidential race. So, and then the question of spoiler. I mean, my advice, and I tried to do this in 2020, and I think we made some progress on this, is that it's not the Green Party that's spoiling the election. It's the Democratic Party that will not get behind instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting and end the spoiler problem. So, you know, if I was the candidate this time when I was asked that question, I would have said to the media, we have a solution. It's ranked choice voting. Go ask Kamala Harris or Joe Biden before that, will you support ranked choice voting? And if they don't, they're the ones perpetuating the spoiler problem. If we don't, you know, get into those races where we can raise those questions, they never get discussed. On the other hand, I agree with you. The Green Party should be, you know, like I said, instead of electing a couple hundred, we should be electing thousands to local office, and on that foundation, build up to the state legislatures and the House. I think that's the way forward. So,
thank you for your answer.
Yeah, and I'll just say this also. I mean, in my experience, the stronger a independent left candidate is, the more it moves the whole. It takes away support from the right. One of the problems with our Democratic Party is it normalizes the neo-fascists. So, like on immigration reform.
Oh yeah, they like shifted to the right, definitely.
Yeah, and with bipartisan saying, I mean, with Biden saying, I want to do bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow us last election. You know, that's like saying they're a normal party. They're a party that has to be defeated ideologically, politically, and, you know, just ridiculed for being so, you know, fanciful about the truth. So if we leave it to the Democrats to fight the right, the whole spectrum is going to keep moving to the right, as it has since the 70s, when the Democrats changed from being New Deal Democrats, mildly social democratic, to being just corporate New Democrats. And, you know, Reagan gets credit for cutting a lot of the social safety net and tax cuts for the rich, but it was a Democratic majority Congress that voted for that. So, you know, it's a shared responsibility, this whole neoliberal project for the last 50 years.
I mean, the reason why the Democratic Party is shifting right is because, like, it's filled with, you know, center-right sort of neoliberals, right? So, like, again, maybe if there were more left-wing people in the Democratic Party, we could have had, like, Bernie run for president in 2016 or 2020, which would have been, like, a way better outcome than in sort of our timeline. So, like...
Well, I think what Bernie did, Jesse Jackson did as well. And it's a shame that no, you know, progressive Democrat did the same between the '88 campaign and the 2016 campaign. But, you know, Bernie gets attacked like the Greens do for, you know, spoiling the election for the centrists who are going to win, which I think is a mistake. You're already hearing that in analysis from, you know, Democratic Party honchos that, you know, Harris wasn't strong enough on national defense. and she was trying to out-hawk Trump, and she did. I mean, Trump, ran as the peace candidate. He's going to end the wars. He's going to end the war here in Ukraine in one day, and he's going to end it in the Middle East. He didn't say in one day, and he didn't say how, but, most voters don't, dig into the details. They go by their guts. And to them, he looked like a strong leader, and he's going to take action. I saw the messaging at one of his rallies was, Trump will fix it, was the card they were all.
Yeah, sort of he represents any sort of change, because at this point the American people are kind of absolutely sick of the establishment, the neoliberal things. So they maybe think that Trump is going to change something.
Yeah. So the AOC and Sanders section of the Democratic Party is about it depends on how you measure it. The Progressive Caucus claims over 100 members out of about 200 or 220 members of the House. So it's the largest caucus. But when it comes to issues, like when the Iraq War broke out, we could only find 25 members of the House that were opposed to it at the beginning, in the fall of 2022. We had these big demonstrations, we lobbied, we did everything, and we got it up to 125. Still wasn't enough to stop, but so you got the hardcore of about 25, and right now the number of members of the Congress, including senators, there are 4 in the Senate, I think 17 in the House, who want to stop arms to Israel, have an arms embargo till this genocide stops. So that's who they are. AOC's predecessor was high up in the Democratic hierarchy. He wasn't a DSA member, but he voted liberal. I mean, for the bills that would come forward in the House, her votes aren't any different than his would have been if he stayed in the House. So, and that's been, the situation. The question is, how do you build the left up in those other districts that are now electing moderates? And that, I think, you have to have a left that's in the streets, in the communities, knocking on doors, having conversations with people. We call it deep canvassing. You don't go out.
Progressive victory, like a canvassing sort of organization.
Yeah, we call it deep canvassing, or in the labor movement, relational organizing. And you don't go out and preach to people. You go out and listen and find out what their concerns are. And a lot of people are just glad somebody's listening because they don't feel the political system responds. So you win people over even if they don't agree with your policy just because you listened and you showed up more than once. That's the kind of organizing we got to do. Relational organizing in a union drive is, if I'm in the Teamsters and, there are a lot of Trumpist, Teamsters and we're having a contract fight, I got to work with them. I got to, build, trust and so we can fight together for the contract. So I don't do that by telling them, what position they ought to take. I go first by seeing, what their concerns are and then, figuring out how we can address those concerns together. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but it doesn't have any power. It's like the tail on the donkey. Donkey is the animal of the Democrats. It's and this is not a tail that wags the dog. And the other thing I was going to say is that the Democratic base is about, I would say half of it is, very progressive, New Deal type Democrats, and half of it is, they are neoliberal. They are the professional managerial class. They want lower taxes, and they want, fair treatment for women, LGBTQ people, racial minorities, but they don't want economic redistribution. They feel it's going to come out of their pocket. And it's more than that. They feel they deserve their advantages because they're smarter and work harder, which is kind of an illusion on their part.
Thank you for your presentation, for your sharing your thoughts. I have a question. You said that Trump didn't got more electoral more votes than in 2020. So he won because people withdraw these people who voted for Biden in 2020, they withdraw their votes from Harris. And you said this because Harris didn't propose any radical changes or ideas. But Biden in 2020, he also didn't propose nothing radical, and people understood this. And as I remember, because I was in 2020 in the United States, that there was there at the time, it was a strong understanding that better Biden, which is also a bad choice, than Trump. So people like really were engaged in elections to not let Trump to come to the power. And so something changed this time. And I wonder if people didn't give their votes for Trump, but just withdraw, understanding that it will help Trump to win. So what was the maybe more reasons there are behind this? Or people are kind of acting emotionally, like responding to the support of Israel, as you said, and I also witnessed this protest on campus and in Muslim communities, people openly said that they will not support Biden this time because they support genocide. But they also didn't support Trump. So, and also the opinion that I've heard from some people here in Ukraine and in Europe that because Kamala Harris is a woman, so it's kind of America is not ready for women president. Do you think it played any role in these choices, or?
I think it played some role. I think the main thing was it was a change election. People wanted change, and Trump was the change, and he acted like he was going to change things. Whereas Harris was pretty status quo. She wouldn't, distance herself from Biden on anything, and there was no particular issue that people could say, yeah, Kamala Harris is going to get this for us. She actually kind of, like she did a news conference at one point, said, we're going to expand Medicare to cover vision, hearing, and long-term care, which is a huge issue because a lot of people go bankrupt taking care of their elders, in their last days. And it was like one press release, and then that was it. She didn't hammer home on that. I'm going to make sure that, when the elders in your family get old, we're going to take care of them rather than you go bankrupt taking care of them. A few issues like that. And then people would know what, that she's fighting for that. The one thing she could say is she was fighting for women's right to choose, abortion rights. But a lot of people are thinking, well, that's a matter of the states. And there were abortion initiatives on the ballot in 10 states. And, most of them, all of them got a majority. They passed in most states, except like in Florida, where it was changing a law or constitutional position that required, I guess it was a law, required 60%, and it got 57%. So anyway, she had that with her, but people felt like, yeah, but at the federal government, she didn't say, for example, we need a majority in the House and the Senate, and we're going to pass a law that codifies Roe v. Wade, which the Democrats have had a number of opportunities since Clinton was, Clinton, Obama, and Biden all had the opportunity when they had both the House, the Senate, and the presidency to do that, and they didn't. So anyway, I think the abortion issue didn't become the issue that people thought she was championing because the Supreme Court had kind of taken it out of the federal level. It didn't have the same traction I think they hoped it would. I think in 2020, Trump was the president, and he was messing up big time on the COVID pandemic and a lot of other problems. He was right in their face, and they'd had enough. Whereas now, time had passed, and he was out there presenting himself. He's a salesman, a marketer, and he represented change. And I think a lot of people just kind of shrugged and said, well, let him try again, because Biden, hasn't helped us. And inflation was a big issue. I mean, a lot of people are pointing out that inflation is few incumbents all over the world. Half the world has had a vote this year, and few incumbents have survived. And the common denominator is inflation. And
but was it that bad in the U.S.?
No, it wasn't.
So
it was kind of shocking the first couple of years of the COVID pandemic, and right after we had supply. What do we call it? Supply. The supply got jammed up, so that it was harder for production to meet the demand, so the prices went up. But that was temporary. But that was, it wasn't that high in the United States, but when public opinion surveys asked people what was on their mind, inflation definitely was. And the most visible inflation were housing costs. People felt that gasoline, although that came back down, and food, which didn't come back down so much. So overall inflation came down, but the prices that people knew about didn't. And so they felt the inflation.
So you mean that people's agenda changed since 2020? So this time Trump like fits better than last time, and because of Black Lives Matter protests, that it was a question about racism. Race now there were no such discussions. So this also was the reason that and other topics are in the people's minds. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Trump is a lot more dangerous this time than he was his first term. He didn't expect to win in 2016. He wasn't prepared for the transition. So he picked traditional conservatives in the Republican Party. And the commentators called them the adults in the room that kept Trump from doing his worst instincts. This time, the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, 900-page policy handbook. And more than that, they've recruited thousands of cadres. I mean, their plan is to purge the federal bureaucracy and put their own people in there, hacks who will do what Trump wants. And they're going to destroy, occupational safety and health, environmental protection, education. They want to privatize education. It's going to be a mess, and not to mention what the persecution of political enemies. He's not talking about lefties like me. He's talking about generals, presidents like Biden, Kamala Harris. He considers them, he says they went after him, with these different indictments. He called it lawfare. But the fact is, Merrick Garland, who was appointed Attorney General by Biden, took 2 years before he started moving on, these crimes. And Trump did them. I mean, there's circumstances like calling up the governor of Georgia saying, I need 11,000 more votes so I can flip Georgia to my side. Can you find them? We've got the recording. We've all heard it. And he's saying he's being, politically persecuted. No, he committed crimes. That's the difference. Now he's going to do the persecution. That's really bad. And then rounding up, he says he wants to round up and deport all the undocumented immigrants.
20 million.
Yeah. 12 to 20 million. We don't know how many for sure, plus their families, because a lot of them are in mixed families with documented and undocumented people. So, and then he wants to bring out the military to do that. Will the military follow his orders? That's a question, because military is not supposed to do domestic policing. Are the generals going to say, no, sir, we can't do that? That's, not within our, within the law. But there's I think a 1798 law called the Insurrection Act, which some people around Trump want to invoke, which does allow them to do domestic policing. So there's, constitutional crises, and is that going to be hashed out in the courts, or, these armed militants that support Trump, who got itchy trigger fingers, they like want to get into action. They've been training for it in their, their little militia camps. Where are they going to be when some of this conflict happens? It's a very dangerous situation. So, I mean, that was another problem I had with Jill Stein, as she was saying, it doesn't matter. They're both bad. Calling the Democrats fascists. They're neoliberals. Neoliberalism is not the same as fascism. Neoliberalism may, plant the seeds of fascism in terms of the economic conditions, but it's not the same. And I think that was miseducating people as to how serious this was. So, I mean, we got a real dilemma. Going back to your question about, shouldn't we maybe just let the presidential races are too high stakes, particularly with Trump, that maybe we should just stay out of them. But then we lose ballot lines, and we lose a big forum where some of these issues are debated. The problem is, how do we get attention paid to us? I mean, we had Ralph Nader in 2000. He was a household name. He was better known than the two candidates. And he couldn't get coverage from the corporate media. He even held a news conference across the street from the Washington Post, trying to get coverage. They didn't even cover it. It's tough.
I have kind of two questions. Yeah, some people say that this election marks the end of this hyper-identity politics, that it is not working anymore. Is it true? So, and I also heard that it's the end of big media. Yeah, that Democrats actually own the big media, but they didn't work. It didn't work to convince people to. So people are voting for Trump, knowing he's a felon, convicted, and still, why people are doing this? Maybe they don't believe this big media at all. One reason, or it is not that important. And maybe people don't like this identity politics pushed by Democrats. And so, these two issues. Is it really true that we have this crisis of hyper-identity politics? And is this true that we have this crisis of big media and that, some other channels are now more important to address people?
Well, identity politics without class politics with it is a problem. And that's what the Democrats, they are alienating people, particularly people that are marginalized economically and are white. They feel like black people, immigrants, women are getting ahead at their expense. And the Democratic Party is pretty good on, equalizing things or eliminating discrimination based on race, gender, and those kinds of things, but not on, more economic equality. So they represent more the values and class interests of the professional managerial class, and the small, that class, rather than working class. On the other hand, if you don't deal with the issues that identity politics deals with, racism, sexism, and so forth, you're not going to have a united working class that has the power to make change. The woman, or one of the women that coined the term identity politics is Barbara Smith, who's a key member of the Ukraine Solidarity Network in the United States. And she gets really irritated when people say we got to get rid of identity politics. For them, identity politics was, black people dealing with racism based on their identity as black people, women dealing with sexism as women, gay people dealing with, discrimination against LGBTQ people. But when she was a co-author of a pretty famous statement called the Coahoma River Statement, and they included class too, and the problem is the Democrats don't. So it's not so much identity politics, which just is like people organize around their oppressed identities to, fight their oppression. But you got to also do that on a class basis. And that's where the Democrats, and then of course the right, plays upon that resentment that some people in the, who are feeling their status is being challenged or they're economically downwardly mobile. The Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, then scapegoat, and so first scapegoat right now is immigrants, but it's also people of color. I'll just give you one anecdote. I was getting a table at the regional market. It's a farmer's market every Saturday when we were petitioning. And more than one person came up to me because behind where my table was, there's a long line of people to get what we call food stamps, SNAP benefits, which subsidizes your food. And any low-income people can do it, but it was mostly the immigrants that were lined up. And I think that just shows, the immigrants tend to be more enterprising and, they took the trouble to come to America and all that. And when they hear they can get cheaper food, they'll do it. Whereas the native-born low-income people, it's early Saturday morning, they're not getting up to get some food stamps, to get some groceries.
I use food stamps. I received food stamps for my daughter and use it. Buy some food.
But these Trump types, I would ask them for the signature and they'd say, look at those illegal immigrants. They're paying for the food. I said, and I have to explain to them, if they were illegal, they couldn't get the food stamps. Those are immigrants, and then I'd say, where are the American poor people? These are new Americans. And some of those Trump people said, really? Yeah, I didn't know that. You mean you can't get food stamps unless you're legal? I said, yeah. I didn't know that. That's not what I heard. That's Fox News. That gets back to the media. The corporate media, Fox News has influence in their other, Newsmax. But on the other hand, the people that watch the Democratic Party oriented or try to be neutral, like CNN oriented media, that's just like 2 or 3 million people out of, 150 million voted, about 225 million were eligible to vote. So that's like 1% of the population. So where are they getting their news? they say they're getting it from, used to be they got a lot from TV, nightly news, but there's so many channels, not many people watch that, just older people. And so it is on social media, Facebook, and the danger there is, you know, the false information circulates faster than the truth, or the correction of the false information. There's a saying that, you know, a lie gets around the world before the truth can get its pants on to correct it, something like that. That's the problem with the social media, which the Trump people, I think, very effectively used, and I think the Russians effectively used in 2016. We'll see how much impact they had this time, but I didn't see as much as I did in 2016. You know, when I saw these purported black commentators telling people to vote for Stein, and, you know, Clinton was, you know, against black people, and I'm wondering, I've been involved with the black movement since civil rights in the 60s, and I'm saying, I never heard of these people. Who are they? This is fishy. You know, it doesn't seem right. And then it turned out, you know, they were people on troll farms in Russia. How much of that happened this time, I don't know. But I didn't see as obvious manifestation of that this time.
May I follow up? So, yeah, as you described, this complete neglection of class issues, of classes itself, by both dominant parties are obviously extremely pro-capitalist, yes, and the liberals are ignoring the class reality and the class divisions, while the right is really instrumental in creating fake divisions. In the most crazy things that could be said were said in this electoral cycle by Trump and by his acolytes. So now we are in the reality where, as you described, Trump, this presidential term by Trump seems to be the most dangerous one. Each Republican president, each American president was terrible. Each Republican president, like Reagan, Bush, it not started with Trump. They were already like this completely like right-wing conservative enemies of everyday people. But at the same time, they were these salespersons for reactionary ideas to sell them to ordinary people to vote for them. And now you have, I think in any other democratic country, like a person who would directly say that I will appoint an anti-vaxxer in charge of healthcare. I would appoint one of the worst tech bros, like who ruined actually his the social media he owns, to appoint him to oversee the efficiency of the government. I will dismantle the education department. Yeah, so it would be a no-go for even for very reactionary forces, say in Europe. Yes, but in the US it seems like everything is completely okay. So if we assume that they are now prepared to do all this stuff, or at least part of the stuff of the Agenda 2025, and this will be directly guided by people like all these most reactionary capitalists in style of Peter Thiel, and they again very explicit in what they want. They want to cut off, for instance, Ukrainian aid and to channel everything for Netanyahu's government. They want to do all these tax cuts on a just like enormous level and to replace it with tariffs. Yes, that will lead to even more. Even higher prices, and the cost of living will be like just unbelievable for working people. So what can the social movements do in this situation? Yes, I just recall when Trump was first elected that some anarchists brought a banner that read, "Dear liberals, can we riot finally? Can we finally riot now?" Yes, so maybe what you described, this lack of institutional policy politics between elections, when the parties, they just exist because of the elections, they don't do campaigning, they don't do mass movements in general. So maybe some solution is not in electoral politics now, but in actually doing this activist street work and what one would describe as a more revolutionary style of politics. Or is actually the situation is the prerequisites for this are even worse now than they used to be in the US? What do you think?
Well, I think we need a party that is both movement and electoral. If you're just in the streets, you're basically, in America, and you're a progressive social movement, you're basically doing a militant form of lobbying the Democrats. Because in the end, that's who you're asking to, implement your demands. And if you don't have candidates who can challenge them, they'll take you for granted. I think that's what happened with the Iraq demonstrations. We built up to the New York Times called us the world's second superpower. These demonstrations, they were massive, not just in the United States, but all over the world. The Democrats just shrugged. We got about half of them to vote against the authorization to go to war in Iraq, but half of them voted for it. So our leverage is having, on top of the social movements, then a vote that people can give for the demands of the social movements. The other thing is we need a well-organized mass party of the left that the unions and the labor movement, I don't think are going to do anything more than they're doing now, which is business unionism. It's we get a contract, we provide services. The members of the union treat their union like it's an insurance policy. You pay your dues, you get a benefit. It's not a place where you go to figure out, what's going on in the world and what can we do about it to solve our problems. So I don't think that's going to change until there's a left party, conscious of they want to organize, the working class into a class for itself, to, acting for itself politically, not just in elections, but all the time. And that's going to take a left, cadres going in there and organizing the rank and file, transforming the unions into social movement unions that engage with other social movements, use their resources to support those movements, that organize the unorganized. We're down to 10% of the total workforce in unions and 6% in the private sector. So the labor movement that is now pretty marginal compared to what it once was. One time in the 50s, by the 50s, early 50s, it was up to a third of the workforce was organized. And then you got some countries in Scandinavia, it's like 80, 90%. So we have a long way to go there, but I don't think the unions are going to do that until there's a left-wing party that's got their people in there and it's organized from the base to say, our unions should be more than just, insurance companies. I think the same is true in the social movements. The social movements organized around single issues, which is fine, but a lot of the problems they're addressing, just take climate change. That's a problem that is inherent to capitalism, which is a system of endless growth. And to try to get that to decarbonize and get to an economy that is in balance with nature, that's in steady state balance, where you produce enough to meet everybody's needs, but you don't keep producing more because it consumes the environment. You need system change for that. And that's why you need a party that understands the connections to bring the movements together and understand how they can support each other, and also that we got to go beyond demands on single issues to, system change. So for me, it's about building a left party. And if we do that, then we face all the problems they have in Europe, the pacification and co-optation of the Social Democrats and the Greens, and the authoritarianism of the old communist left. The problem that was seen over a century ago, what they call it, the iron law of oligarchy. The bureaucracy controls. How do you keep a participatory democracy? We should have those problems in the United States with our party. We don't even have one to have those problems with. That's where we're at. We're trying to get caught up to the 19th century when Europe formed these kinds of parties.
I have a question. Howie, first of all, I want to express my gratitude for you to coming here. And I want to appreciate your running for the presidency in US, because I think that your participation made a big pressure on the political environment in the US. And without it, this pressure, I think that the politics will become even less democratic. So it was important to challenge the agenda which is formed by those two parties of American corporate business. I mean, the Democrats and the Republicans. And I found your experience very valuable. So I want to ask two questions. One is about the past and another is about the future. The first, it's what it means to be an independent workers or candidate in US in practical sense. Which challenges you faced, which problems, maybe from the legal stand of view with donations, agitation, for example, or some problems with police or local governments, or people that don't want to mobilize quickly in some short terms. So I want you to share those practicalities. And another question is more global. It's about some kind of possible safeguards in American society which prevent Donald Trump from abuse of his powers, because now they have good representation in Congress. So I see the signs of concentration of power. So what do you think if there are some leverages like media, like mass movements, like some legal provision, or I don't know, something else? I will be very happy to hear your opinion.
Well, being a retired Teamster when I ran for president, and I picked as my running mate a union activist who had been the education director of the Transportation Workers Union in Milwaukee. She was a bus driver, and she had been very involved in the kind of occupation-like movement that they had in Wisconsin when Scott Walker was introducing these reactionary labor and social changes. And she was a leader in that, and I've known her since that time, so I knew she was somebody I could work with. And we found, I think with the media and with even some people in the Green Party, we were like not respected because we were just workers. Our donations, if you look at donations, you can find this on the Federal Election Commission records. We had a lot of people donate, but it was small donations. I've never seen a campaign like this. I mean, almost everybody, you know, Bernie Sanders was famous for the, what was it, $27 donations. That was his average. So he kept asking for 27. But in fact, more than half of his money came from people that gave over $1,000 or $2,000. I had one person max out, which that year was, I think, 3,300 for both the primary and the general election period. And I think one other person gave over $1,000. Most of my contributions are $10, $15, $25. And I had a lot of them, but they totaled up to $500,000. I've looked at Jill Stein's donors, and she's got a lot who are given, you know, 4 figures. Now, we don't take PAC money, super PAC money, which is unlimited. It's supposedly independent expenditures that are not coordinated with the campaigns, but everybody, you know, kind of winks and nods at that. You don't have to have a formal letter of agreement or a phone call that could be recorded to know, you know, how to use this so-called independent expenditure the way the campaign wants you to. But we won't take that money. So, you know, Jill, I think, is raised, she'll probably get to $3 million. But still, you know, when both Trump and Biden are spending over $1 billion, that's, you know, 1/1000th. So I think media and fundraising was a problem for us. Of course, the labor unions, they weren't going to back us because, you know, they were backing Biden to want to get rid of Trump. That was not surprising. At lower levels, you know, having run, for example, I ran for governor in 2014. I got 6 local teachers unions to endorse, even though the state federation said, don't endorse anybody, and told the locals not to do that, but they did it anyway. And somebody slipped us a list of all the locals' presidents, and we sent letters to them, and the state federation said they were going to sue us for stealing or something, which we just ignored, and, you know, their lawyers wrote us a letter, but that was all that came of it. You know, I think it is possible to get the support of unions, particularly at the local level. I mean, I got a lot of union endorsements in local races because people knew I was a Teamster and active in the labor movement. But when you get to the presidential level, it's tough. So that's what I can say about that. The media, I think, you know, they're looking for credentials. You know, I think they're impressed. Jill Stein's a Harvard-educated medical doctor. Jeffrey Sachs, Harvard-educated economist. So that's just the way it works. The media, I think, a lot of the reporters are, they're following people like that because they have aspirations too. And then your other question was about, what was the second part?
About some safeguards, about abusing of power by the
right. Well, there's one thing, and we can pressure Congress on this. If they try to pass laws, it's pretty easy to stop them because the Democrats have 45 or so senators, and you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass what they call cloture, which means the bill goes from being proposed to being discussed and voted on. And the Democrats can block anything if they want to. So that's like the one check left within the government. And the street protests can pressure the senators to do that. So that's one thing they can do. I think, to stop Trump from doing some of the stuff he's doing is going to be really tough, because if he's bringing out law enforcement or the military to carry out some of these draconian things he's talking about, you can protest, but we don't have any power inside the government to stop that. And the protests, who's being affected by those protests to the point where they feel they got to do something different. And I think we gotta protest just to keep our own spirits up. If you don't move and you see what's going on, you can be really down. If you get up and act with others, you feel better, even if you can't win your demand at that point. So I think the other thing is we build movements that are not just out in the street protesting, but in meeting rooms, discussing, learning, teaching each other. I always encourage Greens and their locals to have meetings that are not business, which kind of can be boring. And you don't bring new members to that. You bring people come to organizations because they want to learn and they want to act. So bring people into the actions and bring people into the learning. And once you got them there, like if you're reading something together, have people that haven't done public speaking, have them make a presentation to the group they're already familiar with and develop their skills. I think all that kind of stuff can be done. At this point, they're not going to be able to stop that if it's going on, even in churches and public rooms at this point. If they try to crack down on it because they call you a subversive organization, like Putin would in Russia, and then you got to do it in your homes, kind of underground. But there's always something you can do. I'm just not sure how repressive Trump is going to be and how much cooperation he's going to get from local law enforcement and states' attorneys general. You're going to get resistance in a lot of the states from the attorneys general. And then police departments are going to vary. Some of them are going to be, yeah, we're all with Donald Trump and we'll do whatever he says. And there are others that are going to oppose him, and we've already seen that. So I think it's going to vary by locality, how you can organize that resistance. But that's the best I can tell you. All I know is we got to organize and educate and resist, and how effective we can be aside from that one, check we have in the Senate. So that means Trump will have trouble legislating stuff, but by executive order, the presidency has a lot of power, and Trump will try to acquire more by just doing stuff and then, daring people they might sue to stop him. There was a famous statement the Supreme Court told President Jackson. I think it was, he was removing the Indians from Georgia and Mississippi, and Supreme Court said that was illegal. And Jackson said, well, how many troops has the Supreme Court got? Because he's the president and he had the troops. I think that was the case, but that was the point. Jackson said that. I think it was over the Indian removal. So that's kind of where we are now. We don't know how much law enforcement, how much the military are going to back up Trump's more draconian measures.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts. I'm wondering how important do you think Ukraine was to this choice this year? And we all know that domestic issues are more important for Americans, but do you think that if if there was no Ukraine on the agenda, or if the ending of this last 3 years from democratic organization would be any different, could that potentially make any impact on result, on the outcome of this election?
I don't think so. I mean, the public opinion poll said even Gaza was a concern for just 2% of the electorate. And that was a big controversy. And when the war in Gaza broke out, Ukraine, to the small extent it was being covered, just went off the media, off people's concerns. You know, even the campus groups organizing demonstrations against aid to Ukraine dropped that and just spent all their time on Gaza. So I don't think it mattered much to many voters. As far as the difference, Trump is hard to read, but I think from what he said, he's ready to meet with Putin and, you know, come to an agreement and tell Ukraine, you know, this is a deal you can't refuse, or all aid will be cut off and Russia will keep attacking. And then on the Democratic side, there's no indication that Harris would have done anything more than Biden to help Ukraine, which, you know, has been kind of a drip feed. You know, it's like the weapons systems, they fight over whether they should give them, they finally give them, and then they get there late. The ammunition got there late. There was a 7-month pause or 6-month pause in aid because they couldn't get it passed in the Congress. That the Republicans had a veto, even though they didn't have, you know, a strong majority. But there's the only indication that Harris might have been better for Ukraine was one of her advisors was more, you know, wanted more support for Ukraine. But would he have got the right position in the Harris administration? We'll never know.
The Green Party practically hates Ukraine and are pro-Russian. And Jill Stein is practically a Putinist. So it's very bad alternative to elect Green Party members on the question of Ukraine. And to be honest, for me, it's hard to morally adjust like why a person would vote for Jill Stein, because she has values that will get us all killed. And that's extremely awful. And I cannot understand why this fact is kind of not mentioned and not spoken more about. Because it's hard issue. I wouldn't vote, for example, for Jill Stein in this condition. She wants us killed, literally. And a lot of members of Green Party too. I think they're split 50-50. Yes?
There's what?
Split 50-50 on pro-Ukrainian and anti-Ukrainian.
Yeah.
And these people are worse than Democratic Party on Ukraine. And yeah, just that's it.
Yeah, I feel what you're saying, and it's I don't think she wants the Ukrainians killed. I think she's naive. She don't know the first thing about Ukraine. She's never talked to you guys. She's never talked to anyone in Ukraine.
But she doesn't want to talk even. So
yeah, well, it's not a priority. So on the other side, you know, people were saying we can't vote for Harris because of what's happening to the Palestinians. So that's why I said my vote was the most unenthusiastic vote I've ever cast for president. You know, and that's why I'm here. The Greens, it's a shame because the Green tradition, you know, going back to the Greens in Germany, Rudy Dutschke and Petra Kelly, who did so much to say we need basically a new left party, not social democratic accommodation to the West, not authoritarian, you know, communism of the East, and dealing with the new issues like feminism, like environmentalism. And when it came to international questions, I mean, Dutschke grew up in East Germany. And, you know, he understood the authoritarian nature there, and he was very good in that position. And Petra Kelly, you know, she was famous for telling leaders of, you know, Eastern Europe that they need to change. So that was, you know, one of the reasons that attracted me to the Greens early on in the 80s. The Americans, the Greens, is like, and I was saying earlier, all Americans are very parochial, ignorant about the world, and arrogant that, you know, they know better than people they haven't talked to, but they might read about or saying. It's a big problem. It's a problem in the culture.
So I was very impressed how you know, working people have absolutely no kind of class consciousness at all. Yes, like I meet some electrician in New Orleans, for example, who explained to me that he's not joining the union because while if you join the union, you can have like $25 per hour. You not always have work to do, and he is working for, you know, $17 per hour, but he always can, you know, 10 hours a day to walk. And I just think, what? How it is impossible? You know, poor person is fighting to walk long hours for less pay. And yeah, but you know, so is it possible that somehow the consciousness of the masses of working class people in the United States will change somehow? So it looks like people are in some bubble of made by 100 years of American propaganda of free market of neoliberal, to say, propaganda, and very few I see very few possibilities how these people will actually organize around any kind of class issues, around any kind of class identity and so on. It looks so impossible that, like my impression about United States is that, it's just lost country. We have no chance. Probably we just leave it alone. Yeah. So maybe what is your opinion? Is it really? What could be these channels, ways to possibly find the mass class organization? Is it really possible?
Yeah. Well, I think another task of a mass party is to create a cultural milieu where people congregate rather than try to solve all their problems or live their life as individuals. So the 100 years is not just propaganda about the free market, there's been that, but the advertising and the consumerism, and that's the way to satisfy your needs. So people buy stuff to satisfy emotional needs that the stuff doesn't satisfy. But, that's the only way they know how to cope. Instead of, socializing with other people and doing things that you don't have to buy stuff to have, enjoyment and satisfaction. So, the socialist parties in the early part of the 20th century, the Germans are the most famous. I mean, they had sports leagues and gymnasiums and glee clubs and reading clubs and, choirs, singing choirs. That's the kind of stuff that the party should be providing to people, because there are no institutions left doing that, particularly in America. There's a book that really documents this well. Since about 1970, all the fraternal associations, like the Elks Clubs and the Masons and those kind of things fell away. Unions shrunk. And people stayed home, first watching TV, now reading their phones or on their computers online. And so there's not places where people, can talk to each other horizontally and, have discussions about common problems and how to solve them. Or just to get to know each other. So there is a sense that we are in the same class. One thing that happened is that small town America, with small companies before, you had corporate franchises and everything, you had the local ownership class and the working class and the professionals, the lawyers and whatnot in the middle. They all went to the same churches, the same clubs. And so there was a certain social solidarity, which meant the bosses weren't so mean to the workers. We're more class divided in fact than we were ever before in our history, because we're more segregated residentially by class. The problem is the way the cities have been built. It's rather than a working class community around a big factory, it's now, suburban sprawl, and people going every which way to different kinds of jobs. So there isn't that similar experience in the same place of work that live in the same neighborhood. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but generally that's where it's gone. So it's harder to, you're right, it's harder to do it, but I think it can be done. It's going to take an organization that's trying to do that. And part of that is reviving the unions so that the union hall becomes a place where people meet, not just to formally conduct business. I mean, like my local union, the only reason that they got the room filled is because all the shop stewards would get their dues refunded if they showed up at the meeting. And it was just bribery. They show up to get their money, You're getting paid to go to a meeting, and they sit there and they don't do anything. I mean, I would try to bring resolutions from the floor, and they were so unused to, you know, parliamentary procedure. They didn't quite know how to handle me, and I made the mistake of blurting out, "What are you trying to do? Rule me out of order?" And they go, "Yeah, you're out of order." And so I gave them the tool they used. So, you know, you just couldn't, within the formal structure, get anything moving in my local. That's got to change. And that's why you need a party that's, you know, got a good consciousness of what the tasks are. And that requires a lot of discussion, a lot of people getting involved.
But still,
yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No, go ahead.
Please. Yeah. Okay, so you not just witnessed, you participated in some of the biggest mass movements in the US since the 1960s. So there is another sort of, yes, doing things in the American society when people do actually find these solidarity networks and spontaneously like build up upon them. So what can you say from your own experience? What were those points where you could really build up this solidarity, and what can be the points for the modern day in America and possibly the world?
Well, in the 20th century, before, let's say, before 9/11, our movements were built horizontally. Like, in my experience, you know, civil rights was both horizontally and vertical because there was money coming in from wealthy people, from unions, to the civil rights movement. Anti-war movement was very horizontal. There were a few rich people that, you know, when we had a big demonstration, they'd pay for the sound system or something like that. But what we had was, you know, groups on the left, but also just people that were sick of the war. We'd have mass meetings where we would hammer out, you know, what we were going to do, what we would demand, and, you know, who the speakers would be. We did that in the anti-nuclear movement against nuclear power. And I was right in the middle of that. The anti-apartheid movement, where we finally got Congress to pass sanctions against South Africa over Reagan's veto. And probably the last movement that was somewhat like that was the anti-globalization, or I think you call it ultra-globalization or global justice movement, the battle in Seattle. Mm-hmm. That was great. And then that movement was growing, and then 9/11 happened. A lot of people got scared because the state, you know, Patriot Act and everything was cracked down. And what had been developing all along and really took root in the 21st century was foundation funding of the nonprofit sector. We call it the military or the nonprofit industrial complex. And now most of the activities where they try to mobilize people are top down. You have very wealthy people funding nonprofits. The staff decides what happens, and then they tell you over the internet what's happening. And you show up, and you haven't, as a rank and file person, haven't had any role in determining what was going to happen. And that's most of the activity now. But none of that activity is really the big stuff. The big stuff has been spontaneous. Occupy Wall Street. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was in the air. I was part of a call for an occupation of Freedom Square in Washington, D.C. that we actually put out before Adbusters put out the call to go to Wall Street. And I think we had the better call because it was government needed to act. Not you don't make demands on capitalists who are, you know, they don't care what you think. They, you know, as long as they're making money and their shareholders are happy, you know, that's not the place. It might be the place to educate the public about what's going on in inequality. But anyway, but the reason, and our they started a couple weeks before us, and the reason that thing caught on, as it does a lot of times, was police brutality. There was some women were killed by the New York police and sprayed with pepper gas. And people got outraged at that. It's like Maidan here, you know, you had the students and then they come and beat people up and everybody gets mad and they show up and it's much more than the original demands. So that was Occupy, but, you know, it spent itself. With the help of the Obama administration, they were very consciously shutting down the Occupy encampments in different countries. The law enforcement cooperated and created provocations to excuse cracking down. But anyway, and then the next one was Occupy, And then we had the George Floyd stuff. What happened in between? There was another one. Occupy's response to the 2008 crisis.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
You had Wisconsin, you had Women's March.
Women's March, yeah. That was spontaneous. I mean, that just happened to everyone. Trump first got elected. And I don't see that similar response to this election of Trump. Or maybe that was when he was inaugurated, those marches started. I can't remember right now. But anyway, the George Floyd stuff was very spontaneous too. And those are probably the biggest uprising. But the demands weren't clear, and that was kind of co-opted into working to defeat Trump and elect Biden. And then Biden got elected and started increasing the funding for police and not funding other services that could deal with situations the police come into they're not prepared to handle, like homelessness or somebody who's got a mental issue. And you get a violent response from the police when, and homeless people need housing and people with mental illness need, doctors. So the kind of issues were raised by that movement haven't translated into policy or any permanent organization. So, what's going to happen in the next period? I'm sure there'll be, spontaneous risings like we had with Occupy and the George Floyd demonstrations. But, those things, you never know when they're going to come. The George Floyd stuff, it was in the air. We'd had demonstrations against police brutality since, Trayvon Martin and the guy in outside St. Louis were killed. I'm thinking out loud. Part of that was because those went viral on social media. Those things have happened, throughout American history. But now, when people see it, they really get upset. And that's why the George Floyd thing was so upsetting, and it got people out on the streets because you could see the guy being killed by those cops, over the 8 or 11 minutes, whatever it was. So,
so maybe now we can collect, if you have more questions, one last round of questions, maybe online, because it seems like people are already exhausted and we need maybe to go into a more informal part.
Do we have questions online, comrades? No? Oh, okay, so I think that we can wrap up.
Maybe one last point, yes, that it's needed to be reassured, reaffirmed, that like in these very dangerous times, when obviously the Trump election will boost the reactionary forces throughout the world, both dictators like Putin and the far right in Western countries, and not only in Western, think about Bolsonaro and other Latin American ultra-conservatives. We need to really build up these solidarity networks that we already have been engaged to, like the solidarity with Ukraine you represent in the US, and really think about some common positive program, some common goals. Yes, and I think that you were among those people who formulated some eco-socialist vision for the future, and now the humanity is facing existential threats, both from military conflicts and from authoritarian dictators, but also from the destruction of nature, destruction of like human habitat, and thus we need to really be in solidarity throughout the world and be real internationalists. So we salute you for coming here and for being consistent in your internationalist support for all oppressed peoples, including Ukrainians in the wake of Russian aggression. Thank you, Howie.
Дякуємо за увагу. Будемо вдячні за ваші реакції під цим відео та за підписку на наш канал. До зустрічі